welcome. We'll first start off, we have a couple of quick questions, and it's just so I get a sense, and Mary and I and Tapi get a sense as to who all's on the call. And they're just basically, what do you do and where do you work? So Kirsten, can you put those questions up? And then while you're filling that out, let me just introduce who I am and then the Institute, and then we'll cut away and Tapi and Mary will do the same for themselves in terms of who they are. Again, I'm Peter Kredikos. I run the Institute for Work in the Economy. We've been around for nearly 21 years. We started as part of Northern Illinois University, but we've always been an independent, not-for-profit, mostly as a think tank on workforce and economic development. And then starting in 2017, we started our foray into the many futures of work, leading off with a conference in September of 2017, and then following up with an initiative we call Achieving the Promise of Work, which is really aimed at, it's more programmatic, it's less of a think tank, and it's really geared to helping people, organizations, communities think through about how work is being restructured, how their local economies are restructuring, and what does that mean in terms of people within the community, individuals within the community, be able to achieve what they believe is the promise of work for themselves, and what the community feels is also the opportunities for the community as a whole. So we're very small. We've always been that way by intention in order to keep our overhead down and to be nimble. And then we use a group of fellows and collaborations across the country to meet our goals in terms of work that we're doing. Let's see what the polls say, first of all, before we move on. Can you give us some numbers? Okay, overwhelmingly, well, by majority, state or local workforce administration. We have some people who are members of workforce boards and service providers. So it pretty much clumps into the sort of mainline workforce system. Can you give us a sense as to where everybody's from, Kirsten? That's the second question.
Yes, so I'm going to put that poll up now. So they are two separate.
Oh, okay. Okay,
so
sorry.
We'll put that up now, and then if you want to continue.
Okay. So while you're filling that out, Mary, you want to introduce yourself, and then Tapi?
Happy to. It's always harder to get the mute button off than you expect, right? So good morning, everyone. Very glad to have a chance to be with you. I'm coming to you from Florida. One of the great advantages, I guess, of working remotely. I can be wherever I would like to be. I'm with the SHRM Foundation. That's the Society for Human Resource Management. I run the HR apprenticeship program. Certainly what the foundation does is try to bring tools and resources to HR professionals in order to be able to bring the world of work for all, particularly focusing on underrepresented populations and how do we make it easier for HR professionals to bring untapped talent into their workforce. I'm also here though because I'm a member of the board of the Institute for Work and Economy, and have been working on this whole challenge of what the future of work will look like. I'm so glad to have a chance to be with you today. Topi, I think you're up next.
No problem. Hi, everybody, and good morning. I'm sure you can all recognize I have an English accent, but I'm also in Chicago. I've lived here since probably about coming up to 2 years now. And I work with the Kraft Heinz company. At Kraft Heinz, I'm the global head of employee digital experience. So Kraft Heinz, as you guys may or may not know the name of the organization, but I'm sure you're familiar with our products. We make ketchup, tomato ketchup, mac and cheese, Planters, and we have 40,000 employees, and our employees are split 50-50 actually. So we have like 50% of our employees, or about 16,000 frontline workers. And then the other half are our knowledge workers, or we got like, you know, you may also be familiar with the term white collar workers, like our office workers. And I look at how they can use technology to achieve the promise of work. And as Peter and Mary also alluded to, I also sit on the board of the Institute of Work and Economy, have done so for probably coming up to a year now. And it's fantastic. It's great and exciting to look at how we can rethink how work and what it means to come to work and what it means to achieve your purpose in work. So I'm really excited and proud of the work that we do, but I'm also very excited to be here and talk to everybody about the future of work from my perspective. Thank you.
And in the tradition of the fact that we all multitask, Tapi has been summoned by her boss for a quick meeting, so she's going to drop out for a little bit and then come back in. So I don't want anybody to think that he's quit on us or anything. It's a planned departure, and we're having to work around that. I'm going to take a few minutes to essentially frame the issues for today's discussion, and it's really focused on, as the title of the workshop suggests, around remote work. But we need to be clear about some of the ways in which the various manifestations of remote work and how they will play out in terms of what that means for the workforce system. So there are really two ways in my mind in terms of how you think of remote work. First, as employees who work from their homes or in small off-site centers away from the main office that are either co-working spaces or might be an exclusive area for the employer, like they may set up a small office in a shopping mall for workers to come together, but not go down to the main office. Second, remote workers also include freelancers or people who are self-employed. Gig workers is another term for them. They're independent of the businesses that pay them for their work. And these two groups have some common characteristics, but each is distinctly different in terms of their former relationships with those who engage them in work. We're not going to get into the legal definitions of who an employee is and what's the test and so forth. Just an easy way of think of it, employees are people who get W-2 forms at the end of the year. And whether they're categorized correctly or not is not material for this discussion today. So they're the ones that get a W-2, they receive the wage or a salary for their work, and that's their relationship with their employer. The others either get 1099s, as independent contractors, or if they're incorporated as self-employed, then they earn their income from their business. The business may not get a 1099, but it is a specific and contractual relationship between two businesses in effect. So those who are W-2 employees, they're covered by unemployment insurance, they're covered by workers' comp, they're covered by employer provided benefits if there are benefits that other workers receive. They're subject to various protections such as minimum wage. Freelancers and independent contractors are not covered by any of these protections unless it's an incorporated small business and they provide it for themselves. So that business that they own, that individual owns, provided for themselves. But again, from the standpoint of what we're talking about, they don't have any protection under the law with respect to the person who's paying for their work. They're not subject to minimum wage, and often it's project-based or term-based kind of work. So it has a limit. There's a limit in terms of the relationship. What happened with COVID-19 was that there was a sea change in how work is structured, especially in non-customer facing businesses or businesses that aren't doing production. So in Tapi's case with Kraft Heinz, production kept going, but the work that went on in the offices ended up not being done in the offices in many places. And so there was a massive shift in terms of how work is done, and all of you have experienced that in your day-to-day lives. just in my case, we have a downtown office. I have just started going downtown in Chicago for that, but still mainly work out of my home office. Okay. As we noted in the introductions, each of us are coming at this from slightly different perspectives. And I think it's safe to say that we each believe that what we've experienced in the last year will lead to permanent changes. There is going to be some return back to offices, but in many instances, we are hearing businesses saying that they're thinking about a permanent realignment so that their work by their workforce, much of it is going to continue to be for an undetermined amount of time being done out of home offices or remote locations. Some of this was happening before the pandemic. People were using technology to be able to distribute work in different ways. But since the pandemic, this has become almost a normalized life. So what we're going to do, the way we're dividing this work, this conversation today, is that Mary's going to lead off, talk about an initiative that we undertook in 2020 called the Day After Project, where we pose the questions to groups across the country, urban leagues, community organizations in Charlotte, to organizations delivering services to workers with disabilities, to long-term care, to rural Nebraska, workforce and economic development professionals. And what we asked was essentially two things. What will work be like after the pandemic if no action is taken by business, labor, or government? And what should it be like? In other words, what are the opportunities that can emerge in the post-pandemic world? In addition, we're going to, well, those are actually the two questions. What would be like if nothing is done, and then what can be done? So Mary's going to talk a bit about our project, what we've learned from that. As she indicated, she also leads the apprenticeship initiative at Sherman Foundation. And so is going to bring in those experiences as well. And then Tapi is the global head of digital employee experience at Kraft, is really a lead thinker on the integration of remote work and everyday work. And so she's going to approach it from that. And then I'll finish up and address the issues about freelancers, independent contractors, and the like. So Mary, why don't you pick it up and we'll go from there.
Great, thank you, Peter. And I'm pleased to have a chance to be with all of you today. It was nice to be able to be here and be thinking about it, of course, since we are all working remotely. So I suspect, let me just start by saying, I suspect that all of you could join me in making a great list of what is great about remote work. Shorter commute. That walk from the kitchen to the spare bedroom is certainly a lot easier than that 45-minute drive or that train trip. There are certainly fewer coffee stains on my clothes. It's much easier to have breakfast at a table than trying to balance the coffee cup with the breakfast sandwich on my lap while also trying to change the radio station. It's certainly easier to find people. I certainly have found that trying to get in touch with people at various corporations and organizations, it's certainly easier because they are not somewhere on our tarmac or somewhere commuting or in another building or whatever. They are at their computer. It's certainly easier in many ways to be able to organize work and non-work activities into the flow of the day, although sometimes that's not always the best way to manage your life, but it certainly is easier. And certainly we've all been able to see everybody's new puppy and been able to see them on Zoom and learn much more about their families than perhaps we'd ever thought. I'm adding the bit about the puppy because I have one at my feet just in case all hell breaks loose. But I think we can also add to the list of what is limiting about remote work and things that perhaps we find less than advantageous. Actually, my own world, I've never met a number of my face-to-face in person, a number of my closest colleagues at the Sherman Foundation, because I was hired after March 10th. So there are still a number of folks that we actually had a Zoom call recently where we debated how tall everyone was because we had no idea. I've missed those impromptu brainstorming moments, those aha minutes or aha moments where you actually, because you bumped into somebody in the hall or you saw someone outside a building, you had a chance to really think of something that just hadn't occurred to you otherwise. Those we don't sort of have anymore. I also never thought I would say that I miss being at a coffee line at a conference. But I do, because I don't have a chance to meet people like you and have a chance to really hear on a very personal basis what's going on in people's lives. And of course, how it is that then I don't have a chance to convince any of you on an individual basis that the HR apprenticeship program is something you've always wanted to promote with your employers. But I digress a tad here. But what I would like to share with you today is really about what we learned during our day after conversations. As Peter mentioned, these were organized by us with the goal of really listening to people who are steeped in this business of economic opportunity. So many folks were from workforce development, some were from social services, on the economic development side, employers, people who on a daily basis are thinking about how is it that people work and what are some of the issues that are making it more challenging or easier for some of these folks to work. We had 9 different groups and plans to do a few more. Some were location-based. So it was folks from Charlotte. It was folks from Nebraska. Some were industry-based in healthcare and others. And others were actually population-based. So what population were they serving? So in that case, we were working with providers for folks who were dealing with disabilities. And all of these individuals were challenged by the changes brought about because of the pandemic, including significant issues around equity, social unrest, how do we manage all that, and certainly just employment in general. How do we work to improve the lives of people? And also, how is it that we take advantage of the changes which are occurring, and to a certain extent also the problems which were really exposed by COVID. I often say that, you know, COVID really took the Band-Aid off a lot of sores that we have been trying to hide for a long time. And so how do we take advantage? It's a horrible thing to say, and it's an overused phrase, but how do we take advantage of this crisis and the awakening that's occurred by a variety of stakeholders around employment? And I will say that in these conversations, some folks were discouraged and felt that even with this pandemic and even with the quote awakening, that it was not going to help. There were still going to be significant problems. However, many of them were decidedly energized by the possibility and the potential that comes from really trying to confront new realities and take advantage of new thought processes to make some significant changes.
Excuse me, I don't
yes.
mean to interrupt. Someone put in the chat box that they couldn't see the interpreter now. I just wanted to make sure that everyone was included.
Great, thank you. I will get that fixed.
So let me just share with you some of the findings from this group of folks who I should add were not the folks that are ordinarily asked, where do you see us headed? Many of the, certainly many reports that you all read, certainly many conversations that you see are often with the executive directors and the presidents and whatever of certainly well-meaning individuals, but they are not the people who are on the day-to-day front lines. Like I suspect you would believe yourself, like you are, thinking about what is it that we need to do differently. And so we learned several things. We learned that remote work is certainly certainly something that brings great potential for people in the disability community. And I know that somebody mentioned there are a number of folks in Voc Rehab here, and so welcome to all of you. And I'm certain that you have even greater insights on some of this, but certainly being able to leverage the strength of technology and the people who are using technology, this certainly has made it easier for many people in the disability community to fully participate. We're not dealing with transportation issues. We're not dealing with perhaps even the bias that happens in the interview process. We're really able to take advantage of the knowledge and skills that someone has, perhaps working from the comfort of their own home. So people in the disability community are seeing that there may be some real advantages of remote work for this particular population. Rural communities, the ability to work from wherever you are and wherever you would like to be. Certainly rural communities saw some real advantages in being able to encourage people to locate in their communities because that was where they wanted to be. And they no longer had to leave those communities in order to get employment in larger urban centers. So rural communities saw this as a real advantage of being able to leverage the talent that actually wants to be in a rural area. Urban communities that do not always have easy access to jobs, again, where transportation is taken out of the mix. This certainly is helping some urban communities think about the power of remote work. Of course, the issue in those cases is that often those are individuals who are lower income, they have transportation issues. They may also be the folks that are primarily frontline workers. So remote work may also not be the segment of the marketplace that they are looking to be employed in. And certainly we saw, as in addition to the disability community, there was also some positive notes around returning citizens, in the sense that many of those folks may do better in the interview process, may also end up being able to leverage some of their skills from a remote workplace, which many saw as being advantageous. Of course, there are significant barriers that are created by remote work. Certainly, if you look at the hardware and software issues, many folks who are looking for work do not have the computer technology in their own homes to be able to make this possible. It's also an issue with many times folks who are, maybe they have the hardware and software, but they do not have a workspace within their home where they feel comfortable being on Zoom all day long. Certainly, we've heard a number of occasions where students were not comfortable being on Zoom, even if they had the computer, because they felt uncomfortable sharing their home life with either their students or with their faculty members. This is certainly a disadvantage. Broadband, limited broadband in both rural and urban locations. This certainly, with not having that kind of access, limits the ability for someone to have remote work, both for those who are in the workforce and those who are seeking to enter the workforce. We've certainly heard the stories of a colleague of mine had to cite her home when she wanted to move out to a rural part of Pennsylvania based on the number of bars in her phone. So she and her husband were out trying to figure out where they should put their home. But we've also heard the more tragic stories or heartbreaking stories of people who've been approached by police late at night when they're sitting outside a library. All they're trying to do is finish their homework or finish a report for work, and they needed to be close to where the library was to be able to get the broadband access. And of course, the libraries, as being a source of internet for many folks, have been closed during COVID or had very limited hours. So that's also restricted the ability of folks to be able to do the kind of remote work. Then thinking about skills and skill development, how do we shift the teaching and learning of skills to a completely remote environment? This is certainly true for employability skills, things that you think new entrants will gain perhaps over time, how to work in an office, how to communicate effectively, both written and orally, how to sort of build teamwork, how to develop leadership skills. Those are all a challenge when you're doing it strictly remotely. At least it's not the way that we've been doing it so far, as well as technical skills of the job. Many things we're thinking, no, I really have always trained somebody on the technical parts of their job, definitely in person. Certainly that's changing as well, but I think the learning curve or the development of those tools is behind perhaps the needs at the moment. And certainly all of the things around office and company protocols. All of the processes that we have for how we do work were established primarily based on having in-person interactions. And those are all being redefined. Certainly my colleagues at SHRM and the SHRM Answer Desk are inundated with questions from HR professionals asking, how do I do my job now that we're remote? How do we manage a remote and in-person workforce? How do I sort of do the recruiting process? Now we've gotten better at that, but is the recruiting process as good as we'd like doing everything virtually? Of course, I hope to think that my recruiting process went pretty well. It was all done virtually. But what about budgeting for all these operations? How do we make those changes in our budget? And the list of this is pretty endless. And I know you all can add to this if you wanted to. So what are some of the challenges that we see going forward for remote work? I am certain that you are seeing a range of reactions from employers and the individuals that you are working with. And certainly at SHRM, we're hearing of many of these challenges as well. And here are a few that I'm focused on and that we at the Institute are thinking about. And I encourage you to post ones that you're seeing in the chat or to bring them up at the Q&A at the end. Certainly, employers are evaluating the long-term feasibility of remote work. Is this really the best way for us to have our operations function? And how do we design those metrics to evaluate which parts of those operations work better remotely? And what are we gaining or losing through remote work? I think there's probably a whole industry that's growing at the moment to help employers think about what's the best way to produce work. How do we evaluate some things which are perhaps not definable around the value of an office culture, so to speak, or the value of in-person meetings versus not. So I think there's lots of those kinds of metrics that people are having to think about, and particularly for small and medium-sized businesses that are strapped anyway to have the staff to do what it is they're trying to do. To add this as an evaluation problem is just adding to that list of things that small, medium-sized employer is having to deal with. Employees are also having to reevaluate what is important to them about their work. How much better do they think their job has been or worse because of remote work? The commute, as I mentioned earlier, but what about focus time? Are they finding it easier to get things done because they can really block out their time more effectively? They have no travel. For those of us who spent a lot of their time on travel, that is gone. Is that better or worse? Is that something we miss or something we appreciate? Although I think at this point, I would give up losing my luggage if it meant that I could come and be at a session like this one. What about family time? What about your own personal time? Are you having more time to exercise or not? And are these things that you're willing to change for perhaps looking for a new job, or things that you're going to begin to demand of your employer in order for you to stay and be as focused and committed and dedicated to your work as you would like? Then what are those risks and rewards of returning to, quote, the pre-pandemic operations? Thinking about health related, what are the issues around requiring vaccines? What are the things around masking, not masking, cleaning, not cleaning? What are some of those operational challenges? What about employee turnover and about recruiting? I know I've heard from some folks where the company has really said, no, we are going to have an office culture and we're going to try as hard as possible to hire people who are going to be able to come into the office, that they are losing some good new talent because people are saying, I would rather have the flexibility of being able to work remotely. What about reviving that office culture? Is that really an important thing? And can that, quote, office culture be created or maintained with some not remote kind of workforce? What about those interpersonal relationships that you have at work that seem to make a difference? Lots of studies around the value of that employee, co-employee relationship. And what does that mean for you and how important is that on a regular basis? Then, of course, sustainability within the business. How are we going to sustain some of these changes? We're thinking about those accommodations. Used to be we did accommodations for people under unusual circumstances, but now we're thinking about how do we do this remote work within a business model? And what are the equity issues involved with that? Are certain kinds of employees or types of employees getting more flexibility in their workday than others? I'm thinking back to when sort of those first conversations around family time, being able to leave early to go to a soccer game or not, and the people who did not have children thinking that they were losing a particular flexibility benefit because they did not have children. So sort of, I don't think any of us want to see us returning back to a time of the mommy wars. I don't see that as a really great, I do not see that as progress in the workplace. So, and then the last thing is the last piece that certainly I'm interested in terms of my own work in the apprentice field is how does this remote work, how does this affect recruitment and new entrants into the workplace? What are some of those new barriers to entry? Is it harder to get people to feel included within their organization, and particularly dealing with reentry populations, dealing with with untapped talent, thinking about that this may be their first experience coming into the workplace? How is it that when you're doing this remotely, is that person getting all the benefits that we think we're giving this person of entering the workforce? Will they be getting all of that? And how do the training mechanisms that we have currently, how do those work in a remote workplace? Do we have the talent and the time and the resources to be rethinking all of the training programs that we're doing both prior to employment and after employment that seem to make that connection between the person looking for work and the employer work well? And certainly from my perspective, the apprenticeship programs. Apprentices are really, we always think of having the supervisor, the mentor, being able to, quote, look over the shoulder of the apprentice and to guide them. And we always think of that, the pictures are always showing a supervisor helping the apprentice. And how does that happen when we're doing this remotely? And are our supervisors really trained to be able to take on that challenge of the remote workforce when it's, quote, an apprenticeship program or any new entrant? So I would love to see your thoughts on some of this in the chat. Happy to discuss this when we get into the question and answers. And so, Peter, I'm turning this back over to you.
Yeah, we're going to do an audible here. So Tapi was supposed to be next, but apparently her boss has required her presence for longer than she anticipated. So I'm going to flip to my part, and then we'll come back around and circle back on to Tapi when she's able. Again, apologies, but as we all know, when the boss calls, you have to respond. So we'll go from there. So I'm going to talk a bit about looking at it from the perspective of those who aren't employed and receive a W-2 at the end of the year, but instead are out there as freelancers, gig workers, and independent one-person businesses. And how this move towards remote work is affecting them, and what life is like for those gig workers in terms of what the how in fact some of the questions that Mary's raising are questions that from the vantage point of the entity that is paying for that work is no longer their concern. It is the concern only of the individual who's doing the work. And that's really where the shift occurs. The shift occurs in terms of who bears the risk, who bears the responsibility for maintaining an office, acquiring the skills that are necessary to pursue their trade, being able to stay current, marketing their positions, and the like. For 2 years now, my institute, National Governance Association, have been engaged in a project on the on-demand workforce. And we began, and this whole initiative has been around these very questions about what does this on-demand workforce look like? And it's not just remote workers, but it's also even day laborers and people who do physical work but are on their own to do it, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, and the like. And what's the state role, if any, in terms of any safety net provisions and the like. Couple things really jumped out at us as we started. First of all, these are workers that are afforded few, if any, protections. These are workers who have to carry their own health insurance if they're able to do so, if they're not covered by a spouse's insurance, for instance. They have to acquire their own resources to be able to do their work. If they get injured, there is no workers' compensation to support them. If they lose work, typically there's no unemployment insurance to cover them. And we saw a bit of this, frankly, with the pandemic unemployment assistance that came out as part of the COVID relief initiatives over the summer, where states were frankly stunned by, first of all, the volume of filings that took place in terms of people who are trying to make a claim for unemployment assistance because they were not eligible otherwise for unemployment. Now, some of this was fraud. There's some documentation of that, but still, what caught everybody by surprise was just simply that there were so many people out there legitimately making these questions. And that actually was the first question that we asked ourselves as part of the National Governors Association project. And that is, who are these people? Who are the people out there, and how many of them exist? And we were getting various estimates. There have been various studies going back a few years ago where people were making wild guesses about 10, 20, 30% of the workforce population being in this gig economy. Those numbers have gone up and down. Some of those numbers have been disputed. The Bureau of Labor Statistics had taken a very conservative view on this, only asking people in terms of their primary employment and as gig workers, completely forgetting that there's a huge part of the population, and this, again, is part of the remote population. There's probably a very large segment of the workforce, people who are doing this as side hustles. In other words, they have a primary job, and then they're supplementing their income because they either have to, or because they want the additional income to be able to afford that vacation or afford a new car or something of that nature. So we tried to settle on some idea about what that workforce size looked like. Those numbers are still out. We still don't have a very good idea in terms of what that population looks like. Now, organizations like Chase Bank's Chase Bank's Research Institute and others have come at it using platform data and using banking information. And so one of the things that you may want to take a look at, and we'd be glad to help you, is to work through some of those data to get a sense as to what that population might look like within your own communities. It's not very localized, but there may be a way in which you can sort of think it through based on the data that you have, and then sort of step it down to what you think is the configuration within your community. The other issues, though, that pertain, and this is where I think the workforce system is going to be really challenged, is that there is very little support to those to learn in terms of helping people learn how to do this work independently. I've, as it's worked through my career, I've had the opportunity to be able to work from home on many occasions. And in the early days, trying to explain to somebody why a cat was meowing into the phone while I was trying to have a conference call, that was very abnormal then. Now it's somewhat normal now. But learning how to divide spaces up, learning how to set aside a place where I can do my work and others are no longer, and my kids know that they don't come up to talk to me in the middle of the workday or when they come home from school until they check to see if I'm available. Then they start talking. Those sorts of ground rules are things that I've learned to do over time, but that but it's been hard-earned learning. And those who are trying to attempt to do this as individuals working independently, it's a pretty steep learning curve, and we don't support that at all in terms of the workforce system. We also don't support people in the sense of being able to understand what their markets are, what their opportunities are, and in particular also being able to maintain skills in such in a way so that they remain competitive, and being able to both work and learn at the same time. Again, it's not a group of people that has been on the workforce system radar for any length of time. They're just now emerging, and now we're seeing organizations beginning to ask themselves, usually they're independent organizations like the Freelancers Association in New York, beginning to ask themselves, okay, what are the service needs of these groups and how do we support them and move forward? The other issue, I think, in terms of the workforce system, and this is something that I think is this is where there's an overlap between the people who are working for an employer and receive a W-2, as well as those who are in the gig workforce and freelance workforce. One of the things we kept hearing, particularly as an example coming out of rural Nebraska, was, people can apply for work for positions where the employer is maybe outside of Nebraska. That is seen as a great opportunity, but it also poses a great challenge. And the challenge is that now you have started to erase the physical boundaries of your labor markets. And what does that mean? Well, that means that now, instead of you competing for a position within your geographic labor market against other people who are in that market, or people who might want to move to your market to be able to compete, but still you have this sort of geographic, location advantage. That blurs. And when that blurs, that means that you're maybe competing against people for the same work who are in different states or even in different countries. And that's even more so with respect to gig and freelance work, because there is no necessarily geographic loyalty or geographic advantage to some of the work that they're doing. What does that mean for the workforce system? Well, it means in part that there's a shift in who the customer is. If, for instance, people are competing for jobs in that are where the employer is in a different location, that employer is outside of maybe the reach of that community college district, or outside the reach of the workforce area, or is outside the reach of the state. They don't pay taxes to the community college. They're unknown to the community college in terms of an employer. What the community college does know is that we have this individual who is trying to work in that environment, and realigning sort of the thought process where you need to be employer responsive. The thought process, at least insofar as we're talking about in terms of remote workers and gig workers, is that person, that it is the individual who becomes the primary client of the community college, for instance. Now, they've always had that role. I mean, the community colleges have always been very attentive to, and the workforce is in terms of to individuals. But there isn't an employer necessarily that is tied to that community where that connection is made between the worker and the employer. So how does an individual who's a gig worker know about what the markets are that are available to them, know about what the competition looks like for them in terms of being able to have a competitive advantage, understand what the sort of the trends are that they need to see in order to be able to be successful over time? And how, and how do those, the question then is, how do they obtain that information? And then use it effectively, and also have resources to turn to support them in that. So my sense is that one of the, and we've warned people, when we have these conversations with the Nebraska economic developers, one of the things I've said to them is, be careful what you ask for, because what you're also saying is that now you are opening up the community that you want to serve to also be competing against a much larger world. And how are they prepared to do that? So I think that there's a real challenge from the workforce systems perspective in terms of how this process can move forward. The other is that, and Mary alluded to this too, is that, we're seeing, in the workforce system, we were, in our conversations with Nebraska, we were seeing how people were jumping on this idea of, let's attract remote work to our communities, and then there's been sort of a built infrastructure response to that as well. So we were hearing conversations in Nebraska about home builders now designing into their into the architectural plans for the homes for spaces that would be used for home offices. That is, that some home builders are seeing this as a standard operation. I had a meeting recently with an architectural firm out of North Carolina, where we were talking through about what are the implications in terms of their work. And I'm not going to tread into the employer piece of this necessarily, but again, is in terms of, how do businesses like architectural firms and construction companies and so forth be able to start to figure into their operations what needs to occur so that the people who are working as independent workers are supported in that work in terms of just simply the physical configuration. And then finally, that reaches beyond the workforce system, but is largely more in terms of they're tied to the general employment system in the state, is the question about things like unemployment insurance and workers' compensation. So there's been a lot of discussion around portable benefits, allowing people to be able to dip into the unemployment system and being able to bridge between gigs. As the PUA showed us, though, that's very hard to be able to determine with any good independent data as to when there is a period of that should be a period of covered unemployment. So in many cases, what we saw with various states was a function of self-attestation, that yes, we don't have this work, and we would have had otherwise, except for the pandemic in the case last year. Excuse me. Then you get further down the path, and you have questions around workers' compensation, and there that becomes even more difficult to settle out in terms of portable benefits. And that's because there are two components to workers' compensation. One is taking care of the injury. Well, that may be somewhat easier because of the ability to be able to, for individuals to be able to acquire health insurance. But then there's the disability aspect of it. Excuse me. And so if they incur a disability, there's a no-fault system in workers' comp where the employer of record's insurance covers that. Well, there is no comparable side to this in terms of gig work. And it's very difficult to imagine, given the current designs, how you can make the workers' compensation system portable. And then one final note I'll make, and then we're going to turn over to Tapi and have her talk about her experiences, is that from the workforce system, but also from the worker protection system, one of our measures of success is what's the difference in pre and post on wage. Well, with gig workers, that's very hard to determine. And it's what you may be able to do is determine income, but not necessarily wage having an hourly component to it, as an example, or a time period component to it. The challenge that you have with the independent workers, the gig workers, is that there is no baseline standard. There is no minimum wage. There is no number that establishes what ought to be sort of the norm on this. It's project-based work largely. It's episodic. Excuse me, and it is it doesn't necessarily follow, as I said, any sort of it doesn't conform to any sort of minimum in terms of what's right. So measuring success for the workforce system that is trying to engage in supporting gig workers is very difficult under current conditions, under current law, because all those standard measures that exist for waged work, for W-2 work, don't translate over to the gig side. So I think there's some enormous challenges there. The system needs to mature in a different way than what we have today. But it is going to present a constant challenge, I think, for the workforce system to be engaged in this process. So I believe Tapi, I saw Tapi pop up. And Tapi, would you turn your, there you go. So we're
Hi.
going to turn it over to Tapi, and then we'll finish up with an opportunity for questions and comments. Tapi.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter. And thank you, everybody, for being very patient. Actually, isn't that funny that we talk about this dynamic new workspace, and actually in a conference, I have to go and present to my CFO and come back. And I think I know I gave a bit of an introduction into the work that I do earlier, but that for me is one of the nuances of this asynchronous workspace. Actually, then when you look at people who are in office-based roles, or sometimes referred to as white collar or knowledge workers, there is the flexibility now to be very dynamic and be very agile. And how do you extrapolate those opportunities to the entire business, not just in the office space, but those who work in the frontline working space? And what I really like about when we think of like workforce development, for me, I thought, well, how do you enable an organization to progress and proceed in the future? And when we moved to this asynchronous workspace, it really allowed us to challenge the idea of separating business objective from physical location. I don't know how many of you can resonate, but maybe in the past we may have thought, if you look at your personal life, I can only socialize in this venue, or I can only work out in a gym, or I can only go to the cinema, like watch a movie in a cinema. And the reality is, by choice or by force, we were encouraged to separate objective from location. And we really lent into that in Craft Times. Like, really, what does that mean? I'm sure maybe, as most of you can resonate, we rolled out a collaboration tool, which is called Microsoft Teams. So right now we're sat in Zoom. They're typically all the same. It really just depends on like the business infrastructure. But we rolled out Microsoft Teams, and we spent a good few months bringing our employees up to date in terms of what Microsoft Teams is, how it works, and how you can pretty much do what you used to do in this new virtual workspace. Really encouraging us to blur the lines between the physical and the virtual space. I mean, I have this vision of what would it look like if there was no separation and no difference between being physically or virtually next to somebody. But you can't deny the fact that there's the need for the human interaction, right? And even when it comes to being successful and effective in a digital workspace, we then realized, okay, when you understand how to use the tools, there are certain behaviors, and the behaviors we can summarize as like 4. One is like the art of collaboration. What does it mean to collaborate when you can be physically or virtually next to somebody? The second one being how to meet smarter. So how to rethink achieving business objectives, not just physically next to one another in a call or via an email, but rethinking how you can use tools to deliver this. The third one is agility. And as I mentioned earlier, you saw an example of being agile, right? I just sat in the same space, turned my camera off, and went onto my other desktop to join another call. And then the fourth one looks at design thinking. So thinking about how you can achieve business objectives in cool, new, novel ways, and really break down the design process, almost like think like a scientist. But I'm sure a lot of you are in the call thinking, well, that kind of works more so when you can, you have the ability to, when you're not paid, let's say, by output, in the sense of, in the same way it can be sometimes in that frontline worker space. And now we're beginning to explore, well, how do we enable our frontline worker, blue collar workforce for the future? We're actually starting with rolling out something called like an employee engagement survey, and extrapolating that out to our blue collar workers. I'm really focusing on some of the challenges that exist in manufacturing now, more so around this idea of like the sharing tribal knowledge. So there's a lot of tenure, or people have been in their positions for a long time. How do we kind of share that knowledge, that institutionalized tribal knowledge? How do we make it an attractive environment to go into so we can encourage the new workforce, people leaving school to enter manufacturing? And how do we enable like digital manufacturing? And that's more than just like a paperless factory, but how do we, less about the displacement of people, but more about looking at how we can enable this more digitally savvy manufacturing workforce. And one of the things I was quite interested in, especially when it comes to the frontline worker space, and I would love if anybody would be happy to, you can write it in the chat or we can talk about it here. But one of the things I was interested in is, what are the concerns when we think of a more digital future? And there may be things that we're excited about, things that we have apprehension about, or problems that we don't yet know how to solve. Is it like robotics, AI and automation? Is it like the displacement of people? Is it the ability to upskill, the gap between the development and the pipeline coming through, knowing how to do it? But I would really love if anybody would be happy to like share that with me. And I'm just going to move down to the chat so I can see if anybody's written any comments. Okay. Thank you, Peter, for asking people to write their comments. Maybe while I give everybody a bit of time to respond there, I can continue to talk about some of the work we've been doing at Craft Time. So we are a global organization. We're in the Fortune 150. We have like $22 billion of revenue on a yearly basis. And with all of that, we still have the same challenges as any startup. People want to feel connected, people want to feel close to their colleagues, people want to be able to speak in informal ways, people want to have those water cooler moments, people want to be able to innovate and be creative. And now, as we look to return to the office, we've been exploring, well, what is the objective of an office? If we think back to some of the points I made earlier around detracting business objective from location, it's possible to then say, okay, you can achieve objectives without being in a specific location. So if that is the case, what is the purpose of an office? And there is research that suggests there'll be like 3 or 4 main modes of work as we kind of move out of this mandatory lockdown and into a more remote or hybrid type of office space. The first one will be this idea of like deep work, which is when, if you think of deep work, it's like also known as like focused work, but maybe you have a particular time and a particular objective and you want to achieve something in that time frame. And how do we enable people to be effective in that, in the physical office and at home? Because the reality is a lot of us are at home when our homes are not designed necessarily to be working environments. You know, we have our children, we have our families, we have our pets, maybe we have our friends. We live in spaces that are not designed for us to be there 24/7. It's just the way humans have evolved. So how can we rethink how we can give people that ability to focus on what they need to focus on in their home, and how we can give them the technology to do so? But also, how do we enable that in the workspace? You know, there was a big push for the workspace to be very open. And actually, there's a lot of research that says that openness doesn't actually give people the time to really think about business problems, to really challenge and just sit in silence and like ponder. It's not necessarily conducive of that. The second one is around collaboration. And there's some research that's like coming up that suggests that the office will now be a space where people go to collaborate and to connect. And I think that's quite fun, because if you think about it, if I want to focus on something, maybe I would do that in one location. I go to the office as I want to like solve a problem with my colleagues. I want to ideate. I want to be creative. I want to be bounce ideas off people, feel people's energy. There was a post by Simon Sinek earlier this morning where he said, we need to realize that we cannot be 100% virtual. It's difficult to build that connection. There are so many subtle cues that you just sense in somebody that they may not even recognize in themselves. I think it's very interesting, how many times, I'm sure a lot of you have children, you can see a child and they may not say like, I'm upset or I'm happy, but you just sense it. You can see it in their whole demeanor. And that kind of collaboration, that connectivity, that's maybe what the workspace will look like. So then how do we enable a space that can be quite malleable and flexible rather than very rigid and very open plan? And then this third mode is like this idea of creative, or it's also called like design thinking, but like more problem solving. There was a fable I read recently, and it was about a king hundreds of years ago that he commissioned a gold crown to be made for him. And he said, how do I know if this crown is real gold? I mean, in those days, they didn't have all the machinery we have today. They couldn't weigh it. They couldn't measure it. So he kind of outsourced this to like a theologian. And the guy's like thinking, how do I tell the king? How do I help him understand if this is gold? It looks like gold on the outside, but how do I really understand? And he went to like one of these Roman baths, and he just like watched people come in and out of the bath. And he realized that, oh, hang on, water will go up and down based on the weight that goes into the water. And then he realized, okay, if this crown is pure gold, the water should go up by the same amount as something else of a similar weight. If it's pure gold, it will go up by the same amount. If it's gold, maybe with like copper or silver lined, it won't go up by that same amount. And I really liked that story, because I thought, sometimes we have these problems that we need to kind of go away and look to the world to answer for us. But sometimes we put this pressure on ourselves to answer the problem in the moment, and we don't create that time to think and explore and wonder. And a big part of what I think the future of work will look like, and this is actually in both spaces, and in the knowledge worker, in the frontline worker space, is this time to pause and reflect. I feel like this entire pandemic has been a great opportunity for us to just pause and rethink what we do and when we do things, and be the most effective version of ourselves at different times. So I really like some of the ideas that I'm seeing coming up. And I actually even like this idea of a virtual coffee space. I mean, Deb, thanks so much for sharing that. I'd be keen if you want to discuss it further. We've looked at the same thing in Kraft Heinz around this virtual water cooler moments. But I'd be keen to hear more about what that looks like in your organization, if you're happy to share.
Did you want me to talk about it?
If you're happy to, I'd be keen to learn more.
Okay, sure. I'm happy to do that. We didn't intentionally create it. It was actually, honestly, out of a little bit of laziness. What we found is that we could use the same link in Google Meet over and over and over again. So our team meets briefly every morning for coffee. And it's a good way to connect, just like you would in person. And then and it's literally like 5-10 minutes. What we found is throughout the day, someone would say, hey, I want to talk to you about this. Do you want to meet in the coffee room? And that's just how it evolved, was literally by accident. And it was, honestly, it was because we didn't want to keep creating another link every single time. So I admit that it was a little bit out of laziness, but it turned out to be such a positive. And to this day, we still meet in the coffee room when we need to bounce an idea off of someone.
I love that. I love it. Laurie, I love it too. Deb, thank you so much for sharing that. Because actually there's a lot of research, you was talking about virtual coffee, and it reminded me of some research I saw by Microsoft talking about this idea of a virtual commute. I mean, just because we are virtual, right, doesn't mean that we have to let go of the things that we enjoyed. And people like informal conversations. If you think of how you build relationships with people, it's not in the meeting, it's what happens before or after. And the research by Microsoft, Deb, you just triggered the memory in my mind, was exploring this idea of a virtual commute. So, you would have the break between home and office. You would, I don't know, you have your little routine, maybe grab a coffee, you drive, maybe go for a walk, listen to a podcast, maybe read a book on the tube or on the train. And how do you mimic that? And actually some of the ideas, I like your idea of a virtual coffee, because I think, oh, that could be quite fun and quite cool to integrate into the business. And actually, Shelley, I saw your comment too around this like bringing people up to date or helping upskill the workforce. And I think it's quite important as well, because if you think about attitudes towards technology, there's research by a guy called Geoffrey Moore, and Geoffrey Moore says there are like these 4 like archetypes or personas, like these 4 different characters when it comes to adoption of innovation, but you can apply it to technology. And he says you have like a digital enthusiast, and a digital enthusiast represents like 3 to 5% of a population. For those of you who have children, you might think of like, if you have like a child who's so enthusiastic about technology, wants a VR headset, wants to play with everything, is just really, really keen to try new tech, try anything. You can cook a meal, they'll just eat it because they want to just try anything, even if it's in what he calls beta phase, like really not developed. And then you move on to your early adopter. And your early adopter is somebody, maybe like Tesla drivers a few years back. They weren't testing Tesla cars, but they were first to market. And then you move on to your early and your late majority, and that represents a bulk population, the bulk of the population. So in the UK, we had self-checkouts, and I think you also have them in the States, but I can give this example of the UK that once it becomes institutionalized, once it's really well embedded into an let's say an infrastructure, and it doesn't fail, then you have your majority. And then at the end, if you think of it as like a bell curve, the biggest proportion of people sit in this majority. And then at the end, he has something that he describes as laggards, but really your laggards are people who are slower to change, maybe more resisting, and actually more traditional. And Shelley, I think it's really cool when we think about like these 4 different personas, archetypes, characters when it comes to technology adoption, because you have like one group that's very enthusiastic, one group that will try if it's kind of like feels quite cool. You have the biggest majority, which will switch once it's institutionalized and the infrastructure is strong, and there's a very clear value case. And I'm going to come back to the value case concept. And then you have a second group that just will not change. Now, I actually don't think that in any time we are only ever one. So for me, I work in tech. I work with a lot of new tech, but there are still things that in my own life that I'm quite traditional with. So I like to take notes and write it by like pen and paper. And people tell me, Toppy, use OneNote, type it. I don't, I just like to write my notes. It's how it sticks in my mind. So I could be more traditional in that sense. But Shelley, actually, the point I was making was that what I learned was really understanding the value case. So when I first moved to Chicago, as I mentioned in the very beginning of this course, back in 2019, I spent a lot of time just watching people and listening. And I didn't actually even, if you think about data collection, you've got like qualitative or quantitative. I didn't even do either of those. I just sat and watched, and I just said, tell me about your problems. And I really just observed people. And that's a type of research called ethnographies, but it really is just this observation. And what I really liked about that is, if you imagine, I wanted to ask people, how do you get to the supermarket? I could do a survey and I could say, how long does it take? Do you take a car? What means of transportation do you take? How much does it cost? And how often do you do the survey? And that's like quantitative, right? I could then maybe do some listening groups and ask a bit more open-ended questions. And you can think of that as like qualitative. But really, if you wanted to understand how people get from one point to a second point, if you could, it would be cool to watch them, right? Because maybe they tell you it takes me an hour, but then they consider the hour their entire routine, from when they maybe put the coffee on and it just takes them a long time to get everything ready. And actually the commute is 10 minutes. Or they might tell you, I take this route, but the reality is they take a different route. They just, sometimes we automate like behaviors and things we know. And what I really liked about this ethnographical approach is that it allowed me to really observe and understand how people do things. And I wonder, Shelley, what your the dynamics are like in your organization. But that observational side, it helped me to establish these use cases. It really helped me to understand like how the business operates. What are like the main rituals and routines? So the main things that people do in this organization on a monthly, quarterly, however frequent basis. So when it came to technology, I was always able to talk less about the technical features and more about the value to these particular business cases. I hope it can offer some wisdom for you. And actually, by the way, if you want to connect outside of here, I'm really happy to do so, because I can maybe even help you like rethink, just maybe based on my experience and research I have access to.
I'm going to jump in with a quick, and maybe Mary can pick this up. There was it's going to be a little bit of segue, and I apologize to you on that topic, but early on there was a question or a comment about hard to serve populations, and I think that that's an issue that a lot of you all are dealing with in terms of this combination of remote and face-to-face kind of work. Mary, you want to try to maybe pick up on that, because you addressed it a bit in some of your earlier comments as well.
Yeah, I was just starting to type something in the chat on this. I think one of the challenges, of course, is how do we be sure that everyone has access to all the technology that we're talking about as being critical to being able to move forward in remote work. And it's, I'm struck always with the distinction between, and Topi, to your point about white collar and professional workers, as opposed to either new entrants to the workplace or folks who are in decidedly lower income kinds of, lower wage kinds of jobs. And how do we create the environment that allows everyone to have access? So I think it does get down to an equity issue around who has access, how do we make sure that's possible, how do we make that a priority, how is it that, and certainly there are a number of corporations that have made, creating the whole digital access, part of their corporate philanthropy, which, for which we are all grateful. But I think it does remind us, to be always thinking about how do we create the access that allows everyone to take advantage of these tools that obviously have, that have great potential and are demonstrating great success. But how do we always think about that?
And Mary, I actually really, I love that point, because what I say in some circles is about this idea of the democratization of tech. It's out there now. Everyone has access because the barriers to entry have been lowered. For example, Zoom. If you did not want to join a Zoom call via like video as we're doing now, you can actually dial in. And I think we need to challenge technology to really lower those barriers to entry. And I think we're on a trajectory towards that. I mean, some of the experiments we're looking at within Kraft Heinz is like VR. Using like virtual reality headsets in our manufacturing space as for like remote assist, but each headset costs like $3,000. So like the barrier to entry is so high that while the technology itself can work, it's just not something we can democratize as it stands today. And I really like that point. And actually, I think another point you mentioned, Ali, either yourself or Peter, you were talking about so I think I understood it as soliciting feedback from populations that are underserved. And that's one of the things, again, we've been exploring in Kraft Heinz, like how do we begin to understand how people in the manufacturing space feel? Because again, the technology, the access to technology is very different. We give all of our white collar workers, they have their own personal laptop, but actually not everyone in the manufacturing site has access to a laptop. So how do we even survey somebody? Do they have an email address? How do we tell people, okay, go to this space to go and complete this survey, but in your shift, are we allowed to ask you to do it outside of your shift? What are what's the union restrictions on a global scale? If we think of like data protection restrictions as well. So there are really interesting dynamics that come up when you think about a total population. I mean, if I wanted to survey all of my employees in an office, I can email them, easily done, and say, at some time, can you fill this out? But do I even have the ability to do the same in other demographics? And it's interesting for me, and I had this conversation with my colleagues yesterday when I said, you know, this is a challenge and we don't yet know how to solve it, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't at least try, and we shouldn't continue to lean in, because maybe how we think now, it won't be how we deliver it, but there must be an answer, because it doesn't make sense that we can't do it. So I really like that point.
To that point, I think part of what we've been doing with the day after conversation is actually to take on directly the question about how do we engage populations that don't typically have seats at the table, so to speak. So in our approach, and Mary pointed this out, you know, we insisted that in working with our partners, that they engage people who typically aren't asked their opinions. So for instance, in the 20-some urban leagues affiliates that we engaged, not one person at the table in our conversations was an executive director. They either managed a workforce program within a local urban league, or they managed an economic development program. They were involved in working with returning citizens. These are all people who have direct on the ground experience. So one of them is to make sure that you reach out and ask, you know, for that you're being very deliberate in terms of what that circle is that you're engaging in terms of circle of people. But the second is, how do you set it up so that, and we've been very intentional about this, so that the power relationship is shifted to the people who are doing the talking, not the people who are asking the questions, or not the people who are running the meetings. And that's a fairly tricky process. But the way we describe it is, how do we set it up so that we're invited, that you invite us in to your confidence, to your room, to your office, to your place of work, or to, you know, just invited into the conversation itself. So, you know, we'll set up the conversation, but then it needs to be turned around so that we're listening, they're talking, and then they lead the discussion. And I think that that's part of some of the issues that we're going to be dealing with in some of this remote work, because a lot of discussion in remote work is back and forth. Somebody called the meeting, somebody's responding to the meeting. And unlike some other work settings where you're all physically present, where you know, or like in the coffee shop description here, but I think distinguishes the coffee shop from other, or, you know, the coffee clutch, you know, from other sort of Zoom environments, is that it's the group that's inviting each other in, that it's all being hosted collectively and not by somebody for somebody else to respond. But that's been a challenge that we've felt, and frankly, it's a major element in the design of our project as we move forward, is to being invited in and asking for others to share that. And the other final point, another point in terms of and we just lost we lost our interpreters here, is exactly this. You know, Zoom is probably better than most in terms of its captioning. I am told by people who use this in the deaf community that it is still pretty atrocious. We don't have the capacity to be inclusive in all these technologies, and as wonderful as our two interpreters are, it is still a workaround. It is not something that is core to the technology itself. And I want to see interpreters continue to work, but it needs to be much more embedded into the technology in order for it to be inclusive. We heard from our conversations with people in the two groups in the disability community, just the lack of awareness of how technology cuts people off, cuts people out of the conversation, cuts people out of being able to approach a resource, a public service. That lack of awareness and simply the design elements are a significant barrier to people with disabilities and participating in routine public activities. So anyway, I don't want to keep going on and on, but there was one other point. I have to be mindful of Mary's time because she too has another employer that also demands her time as well. So Mary, I don't know if you want to sort of kick in with some additional comments, and then I want to touch on the question that was asked about gig work not being good work, but go ahead.
No,
Is there something else you want to add?
I would just say that I'm pleased to be able to be part of this and certainly appreciate all the work that everyone who's on the call is doing around dealing with this, sort of minefield of the remote work and what does it mean and how do we leverage it and how do we help people move through it. I am particularly, as I said earlier, I'm particularly interested in around, what are we doing for new entrants and how are we helping employers think about both the onboarding of new entrants to the workplace and how are new entrants sort of reacting to remote work. And I'd be happy to hear from any of you about how you're addressing that. So I'll put my email in the chat. If anyone has comments they would like to send to me, please do. And I will be on for a few more minutes if there's anything in particular I can address. But thank you so much for letting me be part of this. So Peter, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks. So Jerry's comment was there's a bias against gig work, that is that it's not good work. So here's the reality of a lot of gig work. And actually we've talked about, we, the Institute, have talked about this in the context of entrepreneurship in general too. So you could think of it, gig work, in a couple of ways. There is the people who choose gig work as a lifestyle, as a way of being able to express themselves creatively. You think of musicians as being one of them as an example. There are others, though, that fall into it because their opportunities have been foreclosed in other avenues. And so what happens is that they have a set of skills. They may have some resources like a car, if you're an Uber driver. and because there's nothing else available, you fall into gig work as a way of sort of making ends meet. There's no business plan. There's just, put a shingle out, we'll tell our friends, tell colleagues, hire us. So there is that range that you're dealing with in terms of that workforce population. The challenge then is, how do you serve that entire population from a workforce perspective? And it poses lots of challenges because, or lots of difficulties because you don't know who they are. You don't know how to reach out to them. They don't know to reach to you. They don't know that whether the local workforce resources are available to them or how they can even help them. And I think a lot of it has to do with both lack of planning on the part of the workforce system and lack of awareness, but also, frankly, the way the funding is structured, there isn't a lot of incentive to necessarily do this unless we have some changes in how the workforce system is designed and how people are rewarded for for their performance as a community college, as a workforce board, as a community serving organization, and so forth, that engages people in the workforce. I think a common approach, though, is that it goes back to what I was saying in terms of how we approach our day after conversations. And that is, what is the power relationship? How is it the system that is in effect directing the individual as to what to do? Or is it respecting the individual's agency in being able to self-determine and then figure out how you support that? And in both of those examples of gig workers, from the ones who are looking at this from a lifestyle perspective, the ones who are falling into it because this is the only thing left that they have to do is to put bread on the table, is to figure out how to make it work. approaching both those groups with that kind of respect for their agency, I think then helps to drive the decision-making in terms of how is it that we can support them. I don't know, Jerry, does that sort of get to your question? Do you want to pop on and follow up on that any further if you're still with us?
Hey, Peter, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, no, I think that sort of hits the nail on the head in terms of, I've just noticed that it's a big sort of piece of the puzzle that like we don't really address at all. Like if anything, we definitely steer people clear of it. And was just thinking as you're talking about it that to your point, like if people want to do that, we should assist them in doing it for whatever reason that they're doing it for. But to your point, yeah, the funding models aren't set up. So it's kind of more of a customer service angle, if you will, just because that's what the customers want, right?
Right.
To follow up, I guess a question is like, we also have these like sort of built spaces that are designed for people to come in person and do this sort of stuff. Wondering if you have any thoughts or have given any thought to how we address either, the marketing or the setup or what we do about some of these centers that are like physical locations.
Happy, you want to pick
Sure.
up on that first? Yeah.
Yeah, most definitely so. And by the way, thanks for the question, because what I like is when I see similar themes and threads across different industries and different organizations and just different demographics. I really enjoy that. And that's like one of the questions we've been asking ourselves, because, space is like finite, or a place is finite. We have a building. We can't we're based in the Aon Center, so we're in like a very like high building. We're on like the 70th floor. We can't expand out wider than the parameters of the building. But what I really like is this rethinking how you can use the space, because the reality is we still have the same, in general, like number of people in the world, right? And we still have objectives to meet for our customers or our consumers of whatever our products or services are. And sorry, this is my dog. Sorry, apologies. The joys of working at home. While I realize that you can't really, I don't expect there to be a huge capital investment like this, throw everything out and buy everything new. What I like is this idea of rethinking how you can repurpose space. And rethinking how you can make spaces a little bit more malleable. So while I don't know the specific let's say the infrastructure of your exact space or the architectural design, what we've been doing is thinking, okay, well, what do we know is true? We know we have these video conferencing rooms. We know we have these internet ports in this location. We know these things. So how can we encourage people to rethink how they can use what we have in cool, new, novel ways? And one of my employees brought up an idea today, which I really liked. And she said, what if we like made some videos of people moving through the space, just to give people ideas? Sorry. And I really, really liked it. I really like the idea of like helping people rethink how you can use the existing space. But what it does require is to take some time. I'm really sorry about this, guys. There's someone outside and he's getting excited. What it does require though is to stop and rethink exactly what it is you're trying to achieve. And once you're clear on your objectives, you can kind of re-engineer the rest of it back. What do you think?
I think to add to that, just let me jump in real quick, Jerry, is that when we were talking to some of the folks in Nebraska, and we've heard this in other locations too, but the idea of, in terms of servicing perhaps a customer base or an office, there was one person commented that, and I mentioned this in my opening remarks too, that they were, this one business was creating an open office environment for its workforce at a small shopping center close to where a group of them live, so that rather than going to the main office, they had this remote location to be able to work. Well, that might be some of the, let's say if you translate that to the workforce system, one of the possibilities is how do you have both the opportunity for face-to-face delivery of services at a central location, but also having the possibility of either pop-up offices or other locations that can serve, a particularly hard to reach populations, where congregating makes some sense. Being able to have access to a common set of resources makes sense, where you have to physically be present, but it doesn't have the larger infrastructure of having to have a large permanently staffed operation that serves multiple purposes. So I think that as we think through how these hybrids are going to emerge, and I do think it's going to, what we're looking at in terms of the question of remote work is that we are going to be looking at various hybrid models. Some of them involving, as Tapi is suggesting, reconfiguration of central office space. Again, this architectural firm that I was talking to earlier this week out of Charlotte, that's what they're doing. They're reconfiguring a lot of their for their customers, a lot of central office spaces to be able to accommodate, so it's more hotel work and stuff like that. But also in terms of delivery of services through the workforce system itself is I think going to ultimately have to move to some sort of hybrid model. But I do want to emphasize, I also think that there, as we're in this environment of WIOA reauthorization, that it's also an opportunity for us to be thinking and speaking to the various leadership within the system about incorporating some of these changes and creating the flexibility to accommodate new modes of work within the workforce system design itself. And one of the things I've been advocating, even pre-pandemic, is really a move towards making it clear that that the primary customer is the worker, and that the success of that worker defines and is an indication as to the success of the workforce system in supporting business. Because the person's hired, somebody's doing it, somebody's hiring that worker, and that's a good indication in terms of success, being able to understand what business needs are, but it's the worker that is the primary customer. And I think when you start to shift in that direction, then these issues around remote work, independent work, and so forth start to fall a little bit more into place in terms of a larger design of the workforce system itself. That's my little 2 cents on that.
Thanks, Peter. I see Lydia's asked a really interesting question. And Lydia, I was just replying back to you. And then I thought maybe it could be cool to discuss it too, because it sounds as though, you say any other teacher, so I don't want to project it onto you, but I'm assuming you're a teacher. And actually, I think it's interesting when you think about remote learning, because we've been exploring the same. There are certain things that people learn like through being taught, and then you just kind of learn this idea that we call like through osmosis, by being in an environment with other people, listening to other people's questions and watching how other people respond to different issues. I'd be keen to hear more about your so like the challenges that you're facing, and I'd love to like explore that here if you're happy to. Lydia Kelsey.
Sure. Hello. I would love to. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting how you're talking about rethinking what the purpose of an office is. And I know that another very large transition that we've experienced is the transition to remote learning. And I work with adults. I teach English to adults, but I'm especially wondering how this idea of like, because it's like, what's the purpose of a school building? And I think that school for children is so much more than just the work, right? Like there's so much socialization. There's like a whole nother aspect there. And I'm just curious if there are any other teachers that all work with adults or children. And like personally, I do feel that there is this certain connection. There's certain energies that you can only have in the in-person classroom. I don't feel those same, necessarily that same connection, that same motivation, whereas you can get to learn and like really collaborate with others specifically in a school setting.
Yeah. And Lydia, I like the question again, because you're right. You know, there's a part when people learn, you can't raise a child remotely. How do you teach a child to walk remotely? Oh no, you know, typing a note, raise your leg slightly high, hold onto that table. You have to literally pick the child and help the child walk. And there's a part of like human development where we need that interaction. And I'm so with you that a school environment is more than the four walls. I mean, if we think back to those like four or the three modes of work that I discussed earlier, they are still just like modes that you can apply to different environments. So this idea of I need to focus, I need to collaborate, and then I need to be creative. And the collaboration bit is the bit that you do like in person. And for me, that's where this idea of like this learning and how you move through space and like how you educate people. I do agree with you that it needs to still be done physically. I don't think I can't imagine a world where we move remotely from that until we develop avatars that can actually like touch and move and be real in a new space. I don't know how we would replicate that virtually, but I'd be keen to hear other people's thoughts. Thank you so much for that, Lydia.
Well, with kids and grandkids, having an avatar, I'm not sure how you keep have an avatar help from keeping the kid from crashing headlong into a table. I mean, that's the the test for me. Anybody else want to jump in with a question or comment? We're seeing the comments, but you're welcome to open your mic and ask a question too. Don't be shy. Earlier on, there was, and I think it was actually part of the comment of Jerry's question. I was a little bit implied on that. One of the challenges with respect to the gig work, which doesn't get talked about much at all, is the question as to who owns the work ultimately. So actually, Tapi and I were having this discussion a little bit the other day when we were talking about remote work and just simply the fact that company data is sitting on somebody on a computer that's outside the building. I made the comment to her. I said that I think there's going to be an interesting point in time when, as remote work that for employees becomes more normalized, that we're going to start seeing demands on the part of workers that the businesses that employ them normalize the office environment for themselves. In other words, what's the ideal office setup? How do you configure it? If the person's going into the office at the IAM building, there's furniture that's ergonomically designed, that's part of the normal furnishings within the office. How does that, as it becomes more normalized and people are working remotely, doesn't the company have responsibility for making that, creating that office environment, paying for that office environment, supporting, providing a stipend for internet bandwidth and things of that nature. So you have, I think, some of those questions I think are going to emerge over time as some businesses rely more and more on remote work. When you shift it over to gig work, one of the things that one of our other board members has done a lot of work on is what is an innovative enterprise? And an innovative enterprise has the characteristic that it's a continuous learning enterprise and people are rewarded for that continuous learning. But they have to be part of the system. In other words, there is a handoff from the people who've created some ideas to the person who's helping to implement those ideas and the person who's delivering it. And a good example of that, for instance, is SpaceX. SpaceX has has internalized a lot of operations. They've sourced a lot of their work because they see that as part of a continuous learning environment where the people who are sort of drawing up the rockets have to talk to the people who are launching the rockets. And if the rocket blows up, it goes back down to the person who designed it, and it's a continuous learning environment. When you start outsourcing that to gig work, that idea of continuous learning is severed. The process of that is severed because the person who may have contributed some of the original thinking sits outside the organization and has no long-term responsibility to the organization, but may have performed a work on a particular aspect of something and then is removed from the process. And so one of my great concerns is that as businesses have continued to outsource their work to gig work, it has reduced the capacity of those businesses to innovate and to grow. The challenge from the business's perspective is that who owns the ideas that gig worker has produced? And there's been a lot of legal efforts in terms of non-compete clauses and the like as a way of papering that over legally. But that has the effect of keeping that gig worker from being able to take that knowledge and build off of that in terms of selling their services to a different customer. Not break the IP, but what that gig worker has learned, that constitutes that individual's ability to actually compete, is that they've learned something and they've moved on with something to another opportunity. But if they're prevented from doing so because of a non-compete clause, then that keeps that individual from actually growing their own business, growing their own gig work. And I think there's going to be that's going to continue to bedevil this without bedevil us in terms of an economy and a community and trying growing businesses is how that until we begin to solve that problem. It's a separate piece of this. It's unique to gig work, but even in an office environment, Toppy and I again talked about this the other day, is the notion of how do you retain some control on the part of the business of what goes on in the individual's house that is related to the work of that business. And that's going to be, I think, a challenge as people move on from this. And you probably hearing my dog barking in the background, so I apologize for that. Let's see. Proper etiquette. Tappy, have you engaged much in terms of just simply behavioral support for your workforce?
I love it. I love this etiquette because etiquette for me is very like English. Well, maybe I feel like it's a very English word, and we did create a meeting etiquette. In fact, we called it. Kraft Heinz is like a food company, right? So we called it the virtual recipe book or the virtual recipe guide. And I think it's important to know about, like, there's some simple tips, right? Everybody on mute. If you're not speaking, hey, go on camera if you're happy to, but also there's no pressure to do so. Think about how you liked the environment. For me, those are like the technical requirements of being in a virtual space. But then we took it to another level. And I mentioned earlier about these like digital productivity behaviors. Well, now we know how to set up the environment, which you can kind of just show people like a how-to guide and make it very simple. Once it's nailed, it's kind of done. Well, what does it mean to be productive in this digital space? And what are these new behaviors that we're looking at? So I mentioned them earlier, but I'll talk about them again. The first one was the art of collaboration. And really, what does it mean to work effectively together in a asynchronous workspace, this hybrid workspace? Second one is around smarter meetings. So how do you rethink achieving business objectives in cool new novel ways? Less emails, meetings, and like just meet on the fly. Maybe we can use something like Microsoft Teams, or we can talk in like a more virtual environment. And how do we like manage our tasks and our planner and things like that? The third one is around agility and how can we automate what we do? How can we be nimble, quite malleable, less negatively reactive and positive reactive, and more responsive to the changing environment, the ever-changing environment. And then the fourth one is, how do you think like a scientist? Now, this is not my own research. It's actually by a guy called Adam Grant. He has a book, he's just published a book, I think it was February of this year, called Think Again. And that's where he really encourages this like scientific mindset where you create a hypothesis or like a problem statement and you actively look to disprove it. And if you're unable to disprove it, then you're right. But if you're able to, then you feel confident that you think, okay, that's not how it will work. And how can you problem solve in these new novel ways? And they're new and novel because we've given them a new wrapper, but they really are embedded in the way people think as it is now. Another concept is like design thinking, in this like principle of thinking like a scientist. So for me, the etiquette's like, okay, you can help people understand how to create the optimal environment. Almost like, you know, when we were in a physical environment and it's open space, there's like an adjusting period where, okay, everybody don't speak super loud, be mindful of your neighbor, wear a headset, don't just speak like loud on the, you know, once you nail that kind of, let's say, I don't know, the design, you can move into, okay, really, what are the effective behaviors to think about in this space? Now, those 4 behaviors came out of Kraft Heinz, like knowing our environment. With the other organizations I work with, they seem to be quite universal. But really look at your workforce and say, well, what are the things that we want to be able to do in the future now, and what are the things that we do now and we want to continue to do? And how do we help people think of how they can achieve those? And I use this phrase a lot, but in cool, new, novel ways, in ways that can be exciting and productive for people.
We have time for a couple more comments, but one of the points about accommodating people with disabilities in terms of technology, accessibility and inclusion. One of the things that we've been mindful of in terms of our own organization, and Tapi has actually been part of this process actively, is we decided institutionally that the Institute needs to reflect the population of people with whom we are trying to engage. And so we do that through our board of directors. We have 19 people on our board, which is very large for an organization with 1 or 2 full-time staff people, but an extensive network of fellows. Excuse me for a second. I have a person trying to reach me and I thought I had do not disturb on my phone. I apologize for that interruption. But we've been very purposeful in terms of the design of our board of directors so as to make sure that we are, that I and the work that we're doing is consistent with and reflects the range of issues and the people in which we're engaged on a larger basis. And so again, we've approached this not so much as a checkbox. Say, okay, we have to have so many people who are African American, so many people who are Latinx, and so forth, but more so in terms of just understanding what our work is and what we're doing, and then how do we achieve that through the direction I receive from my board. And so, for instance, we've just added 2 people to the board who are very much engaged in work within the disability world. One is a person with a lived experience with a disability. Another is somebody who is very much an advocate. So I think if we don't open ourselves up to that sort of review, then we miss important elements of what we ought to be doing as an institute. I rely on my board to tell me where I'm getting things wrong, for instance, and what we need to be rethinking. Looking at more questions. I'm not seeing anything. Is there anything that we're missing that people have made a comment on and we're just not picking up on? Please jump in. Okay. A couple of last points, and we're 5 minutes from closing, so this works out fine. We mentioned the day after conversations. Mary mentioned that we're looking to do some more. This has been a project that we've bootstrapped as an institute. We continue to look for opportunities to work with groups to do a day after conversation. It doesn't have to be about remote work. It is, in all of these cases, remote work came up as part of the conversation, not as a deliberate thing. The way we design these is that there are 2-hour sessions, no more than a dozen people on the session. We do require everybody to keep their cameras on. So that's a little bit of our etiquette on that, because we want to have it so that it is like a gathering and people are seeing each other's expressions and body language and the like. And what we do is we start with the 2 questions in terms of envisioning how this, what this pandemic has meant. We have, the conversations have also included the issues around social and economic justice, particularly as they've arisen over the last year or so with the various cases of police involved killing, but also other actions that have pointed to, economic and disparities and social injustice. And then the aim of this is that we try to move this conversation in a way so that the people who are a part of this conversation come up with their own ideas about their next steps. What is it they want to do? So our role isn't to, this is not a focus group. Our role is to facilitate a conversation so that the people who are participating are then taking action on their own, either as an organization or as a group of people. And then our hope is that we can continue to support that. What we get out of it in terms of the policy side has been just a remarkable array of new ideas and fresh thinking from people, as we've talked about, who don't usually get asked for their opinions. And what often happens is that as those ideas people have tried to percolate them up, they get filtered out. And so what we've attempted to do through our project is to remove the filter and to honestly report what it is that people are suggesting to us as what they want to do as next steps. So we've been doing this around the country. We are happy to work within individual communities like we did in Charlotte. It doesn't have to be a city. It can be a workforce area. It could be any number of things. And we've designed this so that, frankly, it's no cost to you. Like I said, we've been bootstrapping this. We're trying to find resources to support our own activities on this, but that's a separate issue from you. So if anybody's interested in this, we'd be welcome to talk to you about this. I'll type in my email address too for those of you who want to connect. And I believe you've gotten Mary's, and I don't know, Kirsten, you have anything else you want to close on? Or Tapi?
No, I think it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, guys. It's been almost 2 hours. I really have appreciated it. Thanks for the flexibility and understanding with the dog and me having to jump into other calls. And I really do wish everybody success. I think this is an interesting journey that we're all on. And actually the reality is we all don't have the answers. So kind of extend grace to yourself and to others as we try and figure out how the future will look like, or at least what does the next day look like. But it's exciting. And what I like at least is that people are now asking questions and willing to not have all the answers right away. So
yeah.
Well, thank you.
Again, thank you on my part too. And thank you on behalf of our 2 board members. And we'll just leave it at that.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter and Tapi, and to Mary, even though she already logged off. This has been a great workshop and discussion. Hopefully it posed some questions to get us thinking, and as well as sparked some answers as well, some potential answers. So just a quick plug as we're closing out today. So this session was recorded, just a reminder, and those recordings for the summit will be up on the summit website within 2 weeks. So if you are wondering how you can access this recording for a coworker, or if you would like to rewatch it or come back to it, you have that accessibility to do so. And then we are going to break. We have a break from 11 until 1 o'clock. So our next session is at 1 o'clock. Lunch is on your own. So as our director, Amy, likes to joke, and she joked on the closing session yesterday, no conference chicken for today. Lunch is on your own. We won't have any lunch sessions today. And then we have afternoon sessions from 1 to 3 or from 1 to 4, depending on the presenter's discretion and what they ask for. We have a wide variety of sessions this afternoon, including keeping youth engaged in a pandemic world, the impact of anxiety and how to overcome it. And that is presented by Zach Gibson. If any of you know Bevan Gibson, if you're familiar with that name, Zach is actually her son. So it should be a great workshop. He is an expert in mental health needs, so he'll be discussing a little bit about that, and it's supposed to be very interactive. We also have using customer-centered design to improve the customer's experience by Jody Sue Kelly. She's done multiple WIOA Wednesday webinars for us, and she is a very engaging presenter as well. If you are going to attend her session, she does have a worksheet on the website that you might consider looking at and filling out prior to her session so you can fully engage. And then we also have the Chicagoland Career Pathways. They are presenting on expanding post-secondary access through system-wide collaboration. And then we also have a workers' rights session. So we hope you enjoy our afternoon sessions, and please reach out to us if you have any questions or concerns about these afternoon sessions. And we look forward to seeing everyone this afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Kirsten, can I jump in one quick thing?
Yes, Peter.
We need to thank our interpreters.
Of course, yes. Thank you so much to our interpreters. Shanna has been amazing this whole conference. She works with us at ISU, and she has been a huge part in collaborating with our team to make this conference as accessible as we possibly can in this new virtual world. And then thank you to our co-interpreter, Alicia, as well. Thank you for that reminder, Peter. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great break, and we'll see you this afternoon at 1 o'clock.
Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Bye now.